Koe koe, this is Stephen Ojiri, and this video is going to be about war manuals, Gunsho, war documents. So it's important to understand. I think that war document, first off, sounds like a simple word, war document, Gunsho. But we start off with that simple term because the English word manual comes with the wrong connotation. There are the documentation of samurai culture and history sometimes comes through war manuals, actual manuals, but it's not always really manuals. It's a combination of manuals and chronicles and diaries and records of all kinds. So it's very important, I think. So I'm going to make this video because I know some people understand the reality of Gunsho, but I think some of you don't. So allow me to present it. In the first part of the video, I'm going to give a brief timeline of Gunsho through Japanese history. Not the entirety of Japanese history, but through the part we're discussing here. That we all, samurai, pre-samurai, samurai times. It's going to go from, roughly the 700s to about the 1700s. And I'm just going to go over it briefly and give you an idea of the type of documents that are being produced in the different time periods. And then you'll start to get an idea of why the word, manual is not exactly accurate, and why you can't just look for a manual if you're going to actually do this kind of research. Okay, so in the second part, I'm going to go into a very specific example of a type of manual from the early 1600s called a Hyoban, also called a Hyoban Hiden. Most people just call it Hyoban though, but Hyoban Hiden is kind of a longer version of the genre. But for the most part, people say that the genre is Hyoban. And then in the third part, I'm going to give some historical examples to try of the early Edo period to try to tie it all together. So the first thing that we want to do is from the 600 to the 800s, pretty much the Gunsho would be the Chinese war classics, right? And I went over this in a previous video. So the Sonshi, the Taiko, things like the Art of War, the Six Secret Teachings, the Chinese war classics are pretty much going to be your Gunsho for that time period. But coming into the 900s, the Oe family start to produce Gunpo or Gunsho. In this case, they produce Gunsho, which present a pro-Japanese nationalist, moving away from the Chinese way of doing war, a shift in the mentality. And I discussed that I discussed the Oe family's Gunsho in a different video. So I won't go over it too much here. Now that transition basically means that the Oe family still transmits the Sonshi, but they transmit it as a text that needs to be corrected, and you correct it by studying their own family Gunsho. So if you can imagine, in the 600s and 800s, the Chinese war manuals are considered the Gunsho. They're the war documents of the time. And then 900s start to come around. You get families like the Oe who start writing native Japanese ideologically, Gunsho. And they push the Chinese war manuals 3 paces away from them. And then, but they only push the Sonshi about a pace and a half away from them. So they kind of really put away most of the war manuals, but they do keep the Sonshi around, but as a text that needs to be corrected by their own Gunsho. So you study the Sonshi, but then you have to study the Oe Gunsho in order to properly understand the Sonshi. Now we jump forward. Let's start to get into like the 1100s to the 1400s. At this point, we start to see a type of text called a Kagame. And a Kagame is usually a court related document. It focuses on specific people, generally speaking. This is also where you begin to get your Gunki, or your war chronicles. They start to come at this time. Everybody's familiar with the Heike Monogatari, and then we also have the Taiyaki of the 1300s. So this is not to say that you don't have little tidbits of other types of Gunsho, but at this time period, the Gunki is pretty much the document of the time. This is where you really start to see, and there's a rise. It doesn't go immediately to the Gunki. It's not like Gunkis just suddenly pop into existence. There is an evolution of smaller genres that lead to the Gunki. But we don't have a whole lot of time. I want to try to keep the video short and compact, so we're not going to go through that. But I would say there's a bunch of little genres that build up through the late 900s and into the thousands. And then when you're getting into the 1100s, 1200s, 1300s, into the 1400s, at this point, these genres have kind of combined to create the Gunki genre, so to speak, the war chronicle. And like I said, also don't forget at this time there's like the Kagame, like there's a text called the Azuma Kagame, for example. So you have like the Heike Monogatari, and then you have the Kagame, the Azumi Kagame at the same time. So different. You got it. You do need to pay attention to the titles of text, because the titles of the text will give you an idea of like the genre of the text. So what you can tell a lot of what's going to be in a text based on the title. So we got to the 1400s, et cetera, et cetera. And, of course, there's going to be so many different war chronicles written up through the 1300s and the 1400s. You start to get into the 1500s, and now the dates, I'm going to try to give dates, rough guidelines. Now, please understand that these dates are rough guidelines. They're not absolute. They're just rough generalizations. From about 1550 to about 1620, you start to get an increase. You start to see lots of, this is when this really becomes a thing, of family documents. Families formulating their histories, families putting family teachings in written form. Now, these are usually private records. These family documents are not made for distribution. They are usually, the family will record its history, record its ideologies, record some of its, teachings and ways, and then that document will stay within the family. You see this happen a lot. So around 1550 to 1612, this is a big thing. Families are really big about making a document of their family tradition, but those documents are not circulated publicly. They're secret documents, so to speak. Then from about 1612 to 1630, we see the rise of the Hyoban documents, the Hyoban Hidens, and we'll talk about those. Now, technically, they start in the 1620 to 1613. Technically, they're probably being written in like the 1615, 1618. But again, these time brackets are loose. They're general. So we say about in the 1620s, we start to see the rise of these Hyoban Hidens. And I'll discuss what those are later. Then from about 1630 to about 1670, 1680, somewhere in there, we find these sort of, I think the word is didactic. I think that's the correct word. These sort of instructional text, which use compiled history to analyze and criticize the history. So what these are massive documents that bring together as much history as the author or authors can find on the topic. And then they go around and they interview people, and they create these massive compilations, and they record and they write these history manuals. And then these history manuals are for the purpose of analyzing the history, evaluating the history, criticizing it, praising it, for the purpose of teaching samurai of the 1600s how to be a proper samurai. So for that reason, sometimes you'll see in these texts they'll record something that in its original document that act might be praised, but in their document that act might be criticized because of the particular view of the author. Critically important to understand. Different schools of thought produced different documents, and the different documents conflict with each other because they have different moral values. It's not that every one of these history books has the same moral values. This is absolutely not the case. There are several different moral systems that end up getting related to different traditions. Like, for example, Koshuryu has the Obata text, right? So like the Koyo Gunkan, and the Koyo Gunkan is a very specific set of morality that it praises and things that it criticizes. But we'll get into that. We'll get into that a little later. But it's important to understand that at this point, massive documents are created from combinations of historical records. So people are finding out everything they can from the existing historical documents in order to create these massive compilations. They're interviewing people, they're gathering oral traditions, et cetera, and they're putting it all together to create these massive collections of history that are then being evaluated for the morality of that particular lineage that's creating the work. All right. By 1670, 75, 1680 to 1700, you suddenly see really long history books. Like, for example, the Go Taiyaki, 1677. But there's something unique about these history books. These history books are not the text that I just described from 1630 to 1680. They're gathering information from all sources. They're even taking oral tradition into account, for example. But by 1680, there is a tradition from the Mito domain, roughly just known as the Mito School. And they take power, they take precedence, they become the top scholars. And they set the precedence for history books must be only verifiable history. So therefore, your history book needs to be long, it needs to be complicated, it needs to be intricate, it needs to be only written from books that are considered to be unquestionably true. You have to verify the books. You no more oral tradition is allowed in the books, etc. They get real specific and strict with a certain scholarly academic viewpoint, and then they really get sort of they become the shot callers of from 1680 to 1700. So you see a decline in Hyobans, Hidens, and these gunkis from the 1630s to the 1680s. Those fall off, and you really just start to see really long, very typical sort of history books at that point. And then from 1700 to about 1720, you start to see a definitive development of straight up history books and straight up fiction books. And then by 1722, it is an edict, it is a mandate that you cannot write any more Gunsho. You cannot create new gunki. You can only write verifiable history books, or it has to be fiction. Consequently, 1722, this is kind of the rise of when people talk about historical fiction, this is the rise of the historical fiction. Now, there's been kind of a misunderstanding about this. A lot of people are claiming that books written prior to 1722 are historical novels or historical dramas. That's not really accurate. If it's before 1722, it might be some kind of gunki during the time period where people were trying to make compiled histories from various unchecked sources. But it's not a fictional tale unless it's from past 1722, and it's not. So if it's past 1722 and it's definitely not a solid, just dry history book, then yeah, it's historical fiction. Because by then you can only produce the two. You can produce dry fiction, or you can produce, you can produce dry history, or you can produce fiction. But if it's before 1700s, nobody's writing fiction before 1700s. They're writing, I mean, of course, let me rephrase that. You do have some people that are writing poetry and stories, but I mean, in terms of the gunki, people aren't writing outright fiction. People are making compilations that include sources that may not be accurate. So that's the key distinction that you need to make. So then we also need to sort of point out that, I mean, let's be very clear about this. So, okay, so first off, because I'm about to get into the second section where we talk about Hyoban. It's important to understand then that at the time of the Mito, when the Mito school's methodology really takes hold, the Hyobans sort of stop, because again, the Hyobans take previous documents and oral histories and stories and everything and sort of blend them all together. That really doesn't have a place in the documents produced under the Mito school's ideology. But it's also this, the Mito school's ideology, that time period, the late 1680 to 1700s and on. This is also really when, to be honest, the tradition of being a history professor or some kind of historian in Japan in general pretty much only goes back to those post Mito documents. If we want to be honest, there's very little deep academic research and study on anything pre Mito school timeline. So so basically, to sum that up, we know there's a long history of Gunsho, and that regardless of the quote unquote forensic accuracy of the Gunsho, we know that the study and possession of Gunsho was important. It was prestigious and it was important, culturally important. So, as an anthropologist, I would say it was symbolically valuable. Commoners loved to hear the biwa, the biwa players singing the tales, plays. There's so many. I don't know if you guys, some of you maybe know that, but a lot of these, for the common people, a lot of these histories are repeated. So, for example, the Heike Monogatari, most commoners never read that. They listened to the biwa players sing verses. The Taiyaki, most commoners never read that, but there were people called Taiyaki Yomi that would chant and recite verses of the Taiyaki. So the commoners loved that. And the samurai, the bushi, regardless if a text may be fully forensically accurate or not, it still was symbolically important. It still had spiritual and cultural value. So collecting Gunsho and being in possession of Gunsho was still considered prestigious. And you would study Gunsho, even though it may not be in what we would call, like I said, forensically accurate, so to speak. It still was important to study it and learn it. Okay, so that's kind of part one. So now let's get into part two. Let's talk about the Hyoban or the Hyoban Hiden genre. So I'm going to refer to it as either Hyoban or Hyoban Hiden because the reason that I want to explain this is because in my Kusunokiru work and study, there are two documents that are critically important. One is called the Taiheki Hyoban Hiden Regen Show, and the other one is called Taiheki Hyoban Hiden Mugokusho. And these are very important documents to the study of Kusunokiru Gungaku, or Kusunokiru in period, but specifically to a school that existed in the 1600s called Kusunokiru Gungaku, led by Kusunoki Fuden and Yui Shosetsu. So a Hyoban or Hyoban Hiden is a type of Gunsho that developed in the early of 1615, 1625 is when it really started to develop. And the Taiyaki Hyoban, well, so the Taiyaki Hyoban, so I'll take a moment to explain. The Taiyaki, so I'm just going to call it they both have Taiyaki Hyoban Hiden as the beginning, and I'll explain what that means. The first one we call Regen Show, and the other one is Show. They are documents that are older documents that have additional material added to them in the early 1600s. So the Regen Show, for example, is an Imagawa document that is then edited, that has the Hyoban and the Hiden added to it. And then it has a prologue and an epilogue added to it. And then a final version of the document. So you have an original document that's older that gets edited in 1620. And the final document called the Taiyaki Hyoban Hiden Regen Show is a publication date of like 1624 or 1620. And then the Taiyaki Hyoban Hiden Mugokusho is the similar thing. It's an original document that's sort of had things added to it and it's been edited, and then has a final publication date in that form of 1624. So these final copies are from the 1620s, but they contain material from previous years. These are the final forms, the final Hyoban Hiden forms. Now, so what are they? So I'll go into those just a tad bit more, but first let me tell you what they are so you have an understanding. In this case, the word Hyoban refers to a critical evaluation. So the way the text works is you have a verse, and then you have the kanji hyo, which means like kind of like a critique or a criticism or an evaluation. It means like evaluation. And then you have an evaluation. So, for example, if the verse contains this battle, then here's an evaluation of the battle. And then after the hyo, you get the hiden, which is the oral tradition surrounding this. So you have so what these are roughly commentaries. So the Taiyaki Hyoban Hiden is a commentary to the Taiyaki, so you read the Taiyaki, and then you read the commentary, and then the commentary has hyo tacked onto it, which is a critical evaluation, and then you have hiden, which is oral tradition that has been passed down and gathered by the authors and added to this. But one of the criticisms of a Hyoban Hiden document is that the hyo is contemporary to the who's ever editing it, and the hiden is unsubstantiated. It's just oral tradition. So you have the original text, the Taiyaki, then you have the commentary to the Taiyaki, then you have the hyo, and then you have the hiden. So this was, so remember I mentioned the Mito School. So the Mito School did not like that. That's why the Hyoban genre sort of came to an end in the late 1600s. The Mito School methodology of like forensic history kicked in, and the fact that the Hyoban Hiden documents were an amalgamation of old documents with new things added to it, and the new things were in many cases unsubstantiated. The Mito School didn't like that. Now, there is a very interesting thing to point out, though. One interesting feature of the Hyoban Hiden documents is of the genre. The hiden is almost always completely plausible. It's a very interesting kind of phenomenon. The hiden always makes sense, and the hiden never really gives you any opportunity to point to it and say that can't possibly be true. It's so interesting. The hiden always makes good sense. And so proponents of the Hyoban Hiden, it's one of the proponents because it would say like, these are stories gathered by the authors, by people that should have an idea about the topic. So, like I said, interestingly enough, the Hedon portions never really give you any reason to criticize them other than they are oral tradition. The Mito School didn't like that though, even though the Hedon never really conflicts with anything. The Mito School didn't like the idea that they're there, so they really sort of just that genre died out when the Mito School ideology took over. So the two documents that I was talking about, the Taiyaki Hyoban Hiden Regen Show and the Taiyaki Hyoban Hiden Mugok. So the Regen Show is based on the Imagawa documents, which I've mentioned previously. So the Imagawa family starts with their non-Taiheki in the early 1400s, and then they have other documents through the 1400s. And you end up with a Taiheki, a collection of writings about the Taiheki that then get turned into, they add the Hyoban, they add the Hiden, they add a prologue, they add an epilogue, they attach a few other documents to it, and they make this giant collection called the Regen Show in the 1600s. Um, there's a Japanese historian named Imae Shunsuke who basically has done extensive work on these, and he confirms, in his opinion, he feels that yes, the root text is an original older Imagawa document, but obviously we know that it was edited heavily in the early Edo period. And the Mugokusho, we I disagree with him a little on this one. I side with the historians who believe that the original text is comes from 1476, but he's not horribly convinced. He thinks it comes from the mid 1500s. So what he's saying is that in the mid 1500s, the root text that is the basis for that would be, actually he believes that it's related to the Yoshisara Gunki. And anyway, long story. So the Yoshisara Gunki puts it into a mixture of a war chronicle, and then also he claims that it's part of those family traditions of the mid 1500s. But he doesn't believe that the that it goes back to the 1400s. But I disagree with him on that. But anyway, the point of the matter being is that they are old documents that get all this additional material added to them and turned into these massive commentaries in the early Edo, like 1620s. Now, there's another one. There is another Hyoban Hiden, the Heike Hyoban. So the Heike Monogatari has its own Hyoban, which is a massive text that adds Hyo and Hiden. So it's the Heike Monogatari, and then you have the commentary, and then you have the Hyo, and then you have the Hiden. The author is unknown though, but I will talk about that in a little bit. The author is unknown, but I'll end the video by explaining who we believe the author is. Okay, so now what I've done is I've given you a brief history, a brief overlook at the different types of Gunsho. We've focused in on the Hyoban Hiden documents of the early 1600s, and I've given you two examples from my own research, the two Taiheki ones that are related to Kusunokiru. So now let's move into part 3, which is going to be giving you examples and more detailed look at that 1600s period, so you have some kind of idea. Okay, so in the 1600s, most of the Gunsho are written by Ronin. The Koyo Gunkan is written by Obata Kagenori, and you have like the Chronicle of Nobunaga, written by Oze. So these are Ronin that are writing these Gunsho. Not every Gunsho is written by a Ronin, but most of them are written by a Ronin. Now you may ask, like, well, why are they all being written by Ronin? Because before 1650, if you're a Ronin, you can't be hired for samurai service. You can't be hired into service, but you can be hired as a consultant, as a teacher. So Ronin would find employment as Gunpo teachers, right? So they basically had to, you can kind of like enumerate this. They had to prove their skill at compiling information. They had to be skillful in teaching the information. They had to have a very, very excellent knowledge of history. And the last one is to to be a Gunpo leader, to be hired as a Gunpo teacher, you had to produce some new updated text. You see this pattern. So again, I'll tell you again, you had to you had to show skill at compiling information, you had to have a great knowledge of history, you had to be an excellent teacher, and you had to produce documentation. So a lot of these gun shows were created in the process of these Ronin starting these military schools. So they want to start a school, they want to get hired, so they have to take all the knowledge they have. They have to be able to then connect that knowledge to all the history that they can. And then they have to produce some kind of text which explains samurai history and embodies the school's teachings and ideologies. And then if you did that kind of stuff, you could do stuff like you could be Obata, Kagenori, and you could do the Koyo Gunkan, and you could do Koshuryu, things like that. Kusunoki Fuden with the Kusunoki Rugungaku. So you have all of these Kusunoki texts through history. And then you have the Kusunoki region, you have the Taiyaki Hyoban documents. And these so that actually the excuse me, the Taiheki Hyoban documents are actually produced not by the Kusunoki Rugungaku, but there's another story, but they're used by the Kusunoki Rugungaku school. So when you say Kusunoki Ru, you can mean a bunch of different branches of the Kusunoki family, but when you say Kusunoki Rugungaku, it's a very specific school, started and run by a man named Kusunoki Fuden, and then continued by his top student, Yui Shosetsu. So like Kusunoki Fuden and Yui Shosetsu, they're Ronin. So in order for them to run their school, they have to have benefactors. So, for example, let's talk about that for example then. Tokugawa Yorinobu was a very big benefactor of Ronin Gunpo teachers. So for example, Yui Shosetsu of the Kusunoki Rugungaku, his benefactor is Yorinobu. Kanbei Yoshimasa Yorinobu is one of his benefactors too. So who is Kanbei Yoshimasa? Well, Kanbei Yoshimasa wrote a text called Seishui Gunki, right? And so Seishui Gunki, that's the military chronicle, the Gunki, the war chronicle of Ise, the history of Iga and Ise. So if you guys who are interested in Iga and Ise, you should get a hold of this, the Seishui Gunki, because in order to get the benefactor, in order to get Yorinobu as his benefactor, he's got to show an excellent skill at history in order to create the Seishui Gunki, in order to get him as the benefactor. So you guys that like Iga and Ise, there you go, the Seishui Gunki. You should go check that out. All right, so now you guys get some kind of an idea of who's writing a lot of the stuff in the early part of the Edo period. So with that, let's sort of end on an example here to give you an idea. Okay, so we're going to actually show two ideological systems that were operating at the same time that conflict with each other. You have you have Koshuryu and you have Kusunoki Rugungaku. So Koshuryu should ring a bell. That's Obata Kagenori's system. That's the Koyo Gunkan. So Koshuryu, Koyo Gunkan, Takeda history and teachings brought into the Edo period. And on this side, you have Kusunoki Ryugun Gaku, run by Kusunoki Fuden and Yui Shosetsu. It's composed of older Kusunoki documents, the Taiyaki Hyoban Hiden documents, and the new documents produced by Fuden and Yui Shosetsu. These two systems are existing at the same time, and they are in complete conflict with each other. The Koyo Gunkan tradition, the Koshuryu tradition, is very aggressive. It's about just aggressive offense. It's not very, it doesn't really care about, murdering all of the enemies. It doesn't really have a whole lot of concern for the welfare of the commoners. It's a very brutal and efficiently offensive system. It's a system it is a system whose goal is to kill the enemy efficiently, and it doesn't take a whole lot of time to consider the welfare of the commoners. Now, this honestly, this really is reflective of the Takeda clan. We know that the Takeda clan were very efficient warriors, but we know they were also really harsh rulers when it comes to the day-to-day politics. Like, Takeda Shingen is a brilliant mind, and he was really good with military and complex thoughts and thinking, but look into the history, he's kind of a really harsh day-to-day politician, so to speak. And this is reflective in the Koshuryu. You see this. This system, and also I should take the moment to say this, so this Koshuryu, Koyogunkan, Obata Kagenori, Takeda Shingen goes back to the Oe family documents. The Oe family, Oe, Genji Yoshie, down with the Sonshi and the Oe Gunsho down through history, bang, bang, bang. We know that ends up in the Takeda clan. So the Takeda clan still has this measure of a specific way to do things that's we all know that Takeda loved the Sonshi, but we also know that Takeda was very specific about that particular Oe family viewpoint. And it's reflective in the fact that this Koshoryu does not really take into account the welfare of the people. And it is a very aggressive system that means to kill the enemy. But Kusunoki Ryugun Gaku, on the other hand, if you remember the previous video, very, very based on Chinese principles, very based on the Kenmu Restoration ideology, very based on Taihei, the Great Peace. The idea of the purpose of warfare isn't to kill the enemy, it's to achieve Taihei. And sometimes you achieve Taihei by means that are not killing the enemy. Sometimes you buy the enemy out. Sometimes you have diplomacy. So Kusunoki Ryugun Gaku is a mixture of war and diplomacy, and this idea of being a very kind and wise ruler to the common people. So in the Kusunoki Ryu ideology, you have to be very efficient and kind and in tune with your commoners, just as much as you have to be able to actually fight the enemy. And you may not even end up fighting the enemy. You might end up scheming and causing the enemy to surrender through a scheme. That stands in stark contrast to the Koyo Gunkan Koshuryu Takeda ideas. So these two schools are existing at the same time, and they are in conflict. So this is an example of what I mentioned earlier. These are two schools operating at the same time, and they have similar types of documents, but they do not teach the same thing. And I should take this moment to say that Hojo-ryu is kind of a split from Koshuryu. And one of the reasons that Hojo-ryu split from Koshuryu was because of this sort of ideological conflict between Kusunoki-ryu and Koshuryu, where Kusunoki-ryu was teaching Taihei and Koshuryu was teaching domination. And Hojo-ryu ended up splitting off. So you end up, the tradition of Hojo Ujinaga and Fukushima Denbei ends up being kind of a mixture of the destructive aggression of Koshuryu and this sort of Taihei of Kusunoki-ryu. But that's for another video. So, but unfortunately, the one of the biggest problems for Kusunokiru is that Yui Shosetsu in the 1950s, sorry, in the 1650s, led the Kien revolt, and it didn't. It helped Ronin get their status back, but it didn't. But in the end, it wasn't. The Kien revolt failed. Now it had some good outcome for Ronin, but ultimately the Kien revolt failed, and Kusunokiru was in deep shit. And so at that point, it, I mean, the leader of the school had a failed revolt. It pretty much, the school is in trouble at that point. So at that point, the school starts to collapse on itself. It doesn't really close per se. You still have students of it, and you still have traditions going on here and there, but it's broken and it's fading. So it's at this time that you actually see a lot of the documents of the school. So the documents that you could only see if you were part of the school, they start to leak out to the public in the latter half of the 1600s because the school starts to close, it fades because of the fact that it was involved in this failed uprising. So you see a whole bunch of documents just hit the market, so to speak, because a lot of people, they needed money. To be blunt, there was a lot of students that needed money, and the school had fallen apart, and the only thing that they could do was like sell their text to publishers and get them what. So you saw a lot of the Kusunoki texts get woodblocked and 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 circulated at this time because they needed cash. To be blunt, they needed cash. So a lot of the secrets of Kusunoki-ryu are very available from like 1660 to 1680. Very available. One of my Kusunoki texts from the late 1600s is one of these printed documents, actually. But so let me close. So let me bring this to a close. But I do want to talk about a guy named Inami Yoshimichi. He is a Kusunoki-ryu Gungaku student. So he studies Kusunoki-ryu Gungaku. And after the fall of Kusunoki-ryu, so to speak, he's still studying, but he ends up going to Aizu. And interestingly enough, in Aizu, he's actually given the task to spy on the Sendai domain. And there's records of him spying on the Sendai domain and receiving rewards when he comes back for his report. When he comes back from his report and he receives rewards, and everybody's talking about this guy, this Kusunoki-ryu student is good. Like, he's a good spy. He did his job. He's a great samurai. then then he writes a document called Koyo Gunkon Hyoban. So he writes the Koyo Gunkon Hyoban at this point, and it's basically a commentary to the Koyo Gunkan, which criticizes the Koyo Gunkan. and, and then after he writes that in about so this is in the 1660s. So then in 1670, he is given the job to teach the Taiyaki Hiden Hyoban Regen Show in the Aizu domain. And then in 1680, when that Mito domain philosophy really starts to take hold, he then writes a history book. It's a post Taiheki, where it basically talks about the events after the Taiheki. So the Taiheki ends, and then he continues the Taiheki up through the 1400s. And so that's a they and it's and so and thus begins a history of the authors. Now, see, if you remember the timeline, so this guy's timeline is now he's writing history books, which we see that. So then from 1680 to 17, from 1680 on, we just see a whole lot of history books. And so what people do is they take a lot of the information that the substantiated information from their schools and their family histories, and they start creating these history books as I discussed earlier. So this is a guy who studied the Kusunoki Ryugungaku and its old text and its Edo period edits and its Edo period creations. And then there was the upheaval at Kien, and then he had to go find work in Aizu, but he was able to get hired, and he was spied. And then after that, he took a he took kind of a stab at the Koyo Gunkan, but the Koyo Gunkan Hyoban, because the Koyo Gunkan, the Koshuru was still strong, because even though the Koshuru and the Kusunoki Ryu Gungaku were in conflict with each other, the Kusunoki Ryu, had its the Kien revolt. So then the Koshuru is sort of still around, and they're basically saying things like, "Oh, see, we're so good because we're still around." But then the Kusunoki Ryu, Koyo Gunkan Hyoban, he says, you guys aren't so good. So, and then he teaches the Taiyaki Hyoban, and then now, as we saw, 1680s, it's time for strict history books. So then he starts writing strict history books. So even in just that guy's life, you can see the different genres, how they come and go out of this one person's life, right? So anyway, okay, so hopefully this video, 3 parts. So part 1 is a brief history of the type of Gunsho. Part 2 was a specific look at a type of Gunsho, the Hyoban Hiden. And then part 3, we looked at examples from history. Specifically, I chose the 1600s to give you a good idea of the older documents, so the Gunkis and the family documents from pre-1600, and how they came in contact with each other and the new way of writing in the 1600s. And then how ultimately all of that became strict history books or strict fiction. All right, so if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments. Otherwise, take care.